Hello and welcome back to International School History Teacher. In this lesson, I want to look at totalitarian regimes and what makes them special. I hope to be able to help you distinguish them from mere authoritarian regimes and address the question of how we might measure the level of authoritarian control or the extent to which it was achieved. In the 1950s, political scientists developed theories and models to help contrast modern democratic governance from what they termed totalitarian regimes, like those in Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia. The most influential of these models was produced by Brzezinski and Friedrich, who identified 6 features of totalitarian rule. Now, along with the social sciences, the popular literature of the time, from George Orwell and Arthur Koestler, helped reinforce the public image of these totalitarian regimes as one in which the individual was completely subjected to the control of the state. The problem is that detailed research by historians since the 1960s has revealed a rather more complex picture. Historians like Hans Mommsen and Ian Kershaw in the case of Hitler's Germany, or Sheila Fitzpatrick and John Arch Getty in the history of Stalin's USSR, have questioned whether party and state control as suggested by the totalitarian model was actually as total as assumed. In addition, the totalitarian model does not help us easily distinguish between, for example, different types of authoritarian governance, or indeed the differences that result from the important role of ideological difference, for example, between communism and fascism. Now, this lesson is about exactly that. There is a long road from democracy to totalitarianism, and we need to understand all the stages in between. The work of the Spanish sociologist and political scientist Juan Linz should be the starting point for any history student looking to compare and contrast authoritarian regimes. Linz identified a series of characteristics that help us recognize totalitarianism. In this lesson, I want to focus on 4 interrelated aspects of this analysis. That totalitarianism can be identified in, firstly, the intensity and effectiveness of the authoritarianism in the regime. Secondly, the importance of ideology as a key feature of the regime. Thirdly, the extent to which rival non-state actors are tolerated or weakened by the regime. And finally, the level of public engagement that is expected in support of the regime.
Do you remember writing in your diary that freedom is the freedom to say 2 and 2 make 4?
Yes.
How many fingers am I holding up, Winston?
Firstly then, the intensity and effectiveness of authoritarian rule. And for this, we don't need to look much beyond Brzezinski and Friedrich's totalitarian model. In particular, then, we're interested in things like the extent of state surveillance and the power of the secret police and the effectiveness of propaganda and censorship. For example, we can make an immediate observation that Nazi Germany was more authoritarian than fascist Italy because the German state was more centralized and its agencies more efficient. But the form of the state is also important. If the state is to have clarity in policy initiatives and is to avoid dangerous factions, a single party with absolute authority is preferable. If there is to be terror, then the party's secret police must play a prominent role in the political power structure. If ideology is to be disseminated and society controlled, then prerogative governance by a single political party is essential. Hitler's Germany, Mao's China, Stalin's Soviet Union all shared these totalitarian features, but many authoritarian states do not. In some other types of authoritarian regime, such as military and personalist dictatorships, the absence of single-party control is one of the key reasons for their relative weakness. For example, Franco's regime in Spain was less totalitarian because although there was an ideologically motivated fascist party, the so-called Falange, the party was just one of 4 influential governing groups, which also included the army, the Catholic Church, and the monarchists. As the Falange became less important over time, so the regime became less totalitarian.
La résolution que je vous demande d'adopter pour condamner l'espion et traître Laszlo Rajk, démasqué par nos camarades hongrois. Je demande à ceux qui sont d'accord de lever la main.
The second factor is the importance of ideology, which plays a central role in determining how totalitarian a regime is. A regime which is pragmatic and concerned with merely holding on to power is less likely to be interested in controlling the long-term aspirations and attitudes of its citizens. But if a regime is highly ideological, then simply holding on to power is not enough. A totalitarian society has an ideology committed to achieving what its followers believe is a blueprint for the destiny of mankind. Ideologies like communism and Nazism are what the great philosopher Karl Popper called historicist. They are much more likely to justify and require greater state control, and as quasi-religious faiths, they are much less tolerant of opposition. South American military dictatorships, African personalist dictatorships, these are in general less ideological than single-party states, and as a result, the level of state control is also likely to be less. They're also more fragile. According to the American political scientist Barbara Geddes, single-party states are much more long-lasting than other authoritarian alternatives. But ideology is also important in helping to understand the nature of the regime. It's not just that the ideology makes the regime more totalitarian, it's also that the nature of the ideology influences the level of totalitarian control. A communist regime has the potential to be much more totalitarian than a fascist regime because communist regimes can remove rival sources of power and civic actors like business leaders and the church. Which brings us on to the third factor, the extent to which rival non-state actors are tolerated by the regime. In a totalitarian regime, almost no area of social life is beyond the influence of the state. The state manages to squeeze out most other independent civic actors. Other political parties, trade unions, local government, the church, and institutions associated with the media and the arts are either abolished or brought into line. In limited authoritarian regimes, the state is likely to have to work with a range of different elite groups without directly controlling them. South American military dictatorships had to work with land-owning elites and big businesses, even when these businesses were foreign-owned. In contrast, in communist dictatorships, where all but the smallest businesses are controlled by the state, the level and extent of control by the regime is much more pronounced. The job of producing and distributing goods in a communist state is the responsibility of an enormous state bureaucracy, or nomenklatura. In the absence of the invisible hand of the market, the communist command economy employs the very visible hands of millions of state employees. This hierarchical system provides the state with direct control over the lives of millions of state officials, but also ensures the loyalty of everyone else who wants access to scarce resources like housing, healthcare, and education. It is a similar story with religion, which can be a serious restraint on the ability of the authoritarian state to act with impunity. Nazi Germany, and especially fascist Italy, welcomed the support of the church, but in turn had to accommodate and co-opt the church via concordats, which provided the church with a role that diluted the power of the state and split the loyalty of its citizens. In general, atheistic communist regimes which persecute religious groups are much less willing to accept the independence of church and rival authorities.
In shaping this first supposedly godless state, Lenin adapted the ideas of Marx and gave a harsher twist to Marx's phrase about religion.
Religion is the opium of the people. It is a kind of spiritual gin in which the slaves of capital drown their human shape. Every idea of God is unutterable vileness, vileness of the most dangerous kind, contagion of the most abominable kind. All modern religions and churches, all religious organizations, Marxism always regards as organs of bourgeois reaction, serving to defend exploitation and to stupefy the working class.
One notable exception to this was in post-war Poland, whose communist government was forced to accommodate the influence of the powerful Catholic Church.
Naturally, the Marxist government, well aware of the implication, is uneasy about a rival creed to which people are willing to devote much of their money and their time. Applications to build churches are discouraged. Only a very small proportion get the go-ahead. But all over Poland, churches are being built, and they're full even before they're finished.
As a consequence, the Polish state was less authoritarian than other states in Central and Eastern Europe at that time. The final key factor in the level of authoritarian control is the degree of public engagement in support of the ideological goals of the regime. This is what Linz calls popular mobilization. The more radical the ideological goals, the more of a transformation that needs to be brought about, and therefore the more the citizens need to be actively engaged, supporting the regime. The Canadian political scientist Ronald Wintrobe classifies authoritarian regimes not only on the level of state repression employed, but also on the loyalty citizens feel for the regime. A regime that is committed to a historicist ideology like communism, fascism, requires the citizenship itself to be transformed. All authoritarian states control the media and use education to promote their goals. As we've seen in another lesson, they can also use this control to distract and entertain the public, to disengage and depoliticize the public, what we have described elsewhere as evasion. But a totalitarian regime requires much more than this. It is not enough for citizens to avoid the sanctions of the state. It is not enough to keep your head down and avoid controversy. A totalitarian state requires individuals to publicly support the regime, to attend meetings, to vote in the right way, and to be heard and seen saying and doing the right things. So in conclusion, how can we summarize the ideas of political science in a way that enables us to make sense of real historical, authoritarian and totalitarian regimes? Well, we can combine the ideas of political scientists Linz and Wintrobe into a matrix diagram. Here we introduce two axes, horizontal and vertical. Along the horizontal axis, we are concerned with the level of coercion and the toleration of alternative civic organizations. As you move to the right of the diagram, the regime becomes more coercive. Along the vertical axis, we are concerned with how significant ideology is and how important it is to mobilize support for the radical historicist aims of the regime. It is in this top right quadrant that we find the totalitarian regimes like Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany. Germany is less totalitarian largely because it has less control over the economy than Stalin's command economy and because the church is tolerated. In the bottom right quadrant, we have what Wintrobe calls tyrants. These are coercive regimes where ideology is of little importance. These we might expect to be short-lived, typically military dictatorships, like the one in Greece in 1968. In the top left quadrant, we have regimes in which ideology is important and where the public are engaged, but in which coercion is not important or not possible. Wintrobe calls these sorts of rulers timocrats, from the ancient Greek for love, timos. Regimes that come to power after popular revolutions can be found here. Cuba in 1959 is perhaps a good example, but one that quickly moves across the coercion axis as time passes. Which brings us to the main value of this matrix. It allows us to recognize that authoritarian states change over time, and that where they have been placed on this diagram represents only a moment in time. Take, for example, Franco's Spain, which after the Civil War and with European-wide popularity of fascism at its height, might have been placed in the totalitarian quadrant. But over time, as fascism is defeated and the Spanish fascists lose influence, and as other civic actors begin to exercise influence, we see Franco's regime move into the pragmatic, low coercion quadrant of tin pot military dictatorships. So after all this abstract theory, it is important to end by reminding ourselves of the reality of these authoritarian states for the people who lived in them. Most authoritarian states will give greater power and social influence to the police and army, and this will be more noticeable to citizens in their daily life. But in a totalitarian state, the paranoid culture of denunciation and state surveillance, the fear of arrest and protective custody, the awareness of the network of camps filled with political prisoners, these are conditions of daily consciousness for almost everyone. Like the composer Shostakovich in Stalin's Russia, the citizen keeps a small suitcase packed ready for the moment when the secret police arrive in the middle of the night. The individuals in a totalitarian state live double lives. In public, they self-censor. They look over their shoulder and trust nobody. It is only at home, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, that they speak the truth. And then, only in a whisper. Thanks for watching.
Architecture of amnesia, scare the people with hysteria. Architecture of amnesia, history lessons disappear.